You are no longer our daughter. Pack your things and get out." Those words cut deeper than any knife, and they came from the very people who gave me life. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, and until that night, I thought family was supposed to mean unconditional love. Instead, my parents treated me like a stranger who didn't deserve a seat at their table. Before I take you deeper into my story, do me a quick favor. Subscribe so you won't miss the twists ahead, and comment where you're watching from, because I know I'm not the only one who's faced betrayal inside their own home. It all started 3 months ago, at my brother's engagement dinner. The house was glowing with champagne glasses, golden lights, and laughter, until the conversation turned to inheritance. My father, with his arm around my brother, raised a toast. "To the future head of the Carter legacy." Everyone clapped, everyone but me. Because in that single sentence my entire existence had been erased. I forced a smile, but my mother's eyes locked onto mine with something colder than indifference. "Emily, you'll find your own path," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice the air. Then came the sentence that shattered me. "We've decided everything will go to your brother. You bring nothing but shame to this family, shame." That was the label pinned on me for daring to choose a different career, for not marrying the man they approved of, for wanting to live life on my own terms. I'd spent years trying to prove my worth, good grades, a stable job, even helping pay the mortgage when times were tough. None of it mattered. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a disappointment. That night, as I packed my few belongings into the trunk of my car, I realized I wasn't just losing a home. I was losing the illusion of parents who cared. My heart ached, but somewhere beneath the pain, a quiet fire began to burn. If they thought they had broken me, they were about to discover just how wrong they were. I thought leaving that night would be the lowest point of my life. But life has a way of testing you, of pushing you further than you think you can bear. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind where the carpet smelled of mildew and the neon sign outside buzzed like an unwanted alarm. I sat on the lumpy mattress staring at the ceiling, replaying my mother's voice over and over. "You bring nothing but shame to this family." For days, I dragged myself to work at the small accounting firm where I'd been grinding out long hours. Numbers had always been my escape. Orderly, predictable, safe. But that week, even the neatest spreadsheets blurred into chaos. Every lunch break, I scrolled through social media, watching my brother's fiancée post pictures of wedding cakes and champagne tastings in the same house I had once called home. My home. Then, one Friday evening, something shifted. I was staying late to close the monthly books when I stumbled across an old file left in the archives. It was labeled Carter Holdings, Estate Review. My breath caught. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The first few pages looked routine, financial statements, property appraisals. But then I noticed transactions that didn't make sense. Large sums moved quietly from company accounts into a trust I'd never heard of. And on the last page, there was a scanned note, signed by my father months before that engagement dinner. The words made my hands tremble. "Assets will be divided equally among my children. Should either be cast out or treated without dignity, the full inheritance reverts to them." I read it again and again, my chest tightening. My parents hadn't just been cruel, they'd broken the very rule my father himself had put in writing, and suddenly the betrayal felt less like a wound and more like a weapon. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, connecting dots I hadn't seen before. My brother had always been my father's golden child, yes, but Dad wasn't blind. He must have known favoritism could destroy us. He tried to prevent it, and my parents, my own flesh and blood, had deliberately hidden this document, rewriting the story to erase me. The next morning, I carried the file in my bag as if it were dynamite. I found myself walking into the office of Mr. Harlan, a lawyer I vaguely remembered from my internship years ago. He was older now, his hair silver, but his handshake was firm. When I slid the papers across his desk, his eyes widened. "Emily," he said, scanning the last page, "do you realize what this means?" I swallowed hard. That my parents lied? He looked at me over his glasses, his voice lowering. It means you're not just the daughter they cast aside. By law, you're the rightful heir to everything. The words hit me like a thunderclap. Rightful heir. Me. The girl shoved out the door. The shame of the family. I walked out of his office with the late afternoon sun hitting my face, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. My parents thought they had silenced me forever. But they had forgotten one thing. Paper trails don't lie. And I now held the kind of truth that could tear their world apart. I walked out of Mr. Harlan's office with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I realized I wasn't powerless. I wasn't the forgotten child they painted me to be. In my hands was the proof that everything they had taken from me was never theirs to claim. That weekend, I drove past my childhood home. The lights glowed warm inside, laughter spilling through the windows, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like enemy territory. I parked across the street and watched as my parents hosted a dinner party, their polished lives on full display. To the outside world, they were respectable, successful, untouchable. To me, they were liars. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and whispered to myself, not for long. On Monday, I returned to Mr. Harlan's office. He had already pulled the official records, and his findings confirmed my worst suspicion. My parents and brother had filed a revised will, one that conveniently erased my name from every page. But the document was legally flawed. The signatures didn't match, and some dates didn't line up with county filings. Mr. Harlan leaned back in his chair, his expression grave yet determined. "Emily, what they did amounts to fraud. If you move forward, this will go to court. Are you ready for that fight?" My chest tightened. Court meant exposure. Court meant headlines. And most terrifying of all, court meant facing my parents again. Not as a daughter begging for love, but as their opponent. I closed my eyes, remembering the night they cast me out, the words that had burned into my soul. "You are no longer our daughter. Pack your things and get out." I opened my eyes and answered him clearly. "I've been ready since the moment they turned their backs on me." The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, affidavits, and tense meetings. Each night I sat in my tiny apartment going over every detail, refusing to let fear creep in. I had lived my entire life believing I was less than my brother, believing my parents when they told me I wasn't enough. But now, every line of that original document whispered otherwise. Then came the turning point. One morning, as I was leaving for work, my phone buzzed with a message from my brother. "We know what you found. Don't push this, Emily. You'll regret it." I froze on the sidewalk, staring at the screen. It wasn't just arrogance, it was fear. For the first time, he knew I had power. I saved the message and forwarded it to Mr. Harlan. His reply came almost instantly. "That's intimidation. This will help us." Suddenly, the dynamic shifted. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the storm they hadn't prepared for. The court date was set. I arrived in a simple black dress, my hair tied back, my heart pounding but steady. My parents sat at the opposite table, perfectly groomed, radiating the same cold confidence I had grown up with. My brother avoided my gaze, his jaw tight. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Documents were presented, signatures compared, timelines dissected. When Mr. Harlan placed the original note on the stand, the one with my father's words, it felt like the air itself changed. The judge adjusted his glasses and read aloud, "Assets will be divided equally among my children. Should either be cast out or treated without dignity, the full inheritance reverts to them." The words echoed in the courtroom, and for a moment, nobody moved. My mother's face drained of color. My father shifted uncomfortably. My brother clenched his fists. I sat there, spine straight, hands folded, and thought, this is it. This is the moment everything changes. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the abandoned daughter. I felt like the rightful heir, finally stepping into the place I was meant to claim. The courtroom felt colder the longer we sat there. Papers shuffled, lawyers whispered, and I could feel the weight of generations of power pressing down on me. For most of my life, I'd been invisible in my family's world, a shadow to my brother's spotlight. But now, every eye in that room was on me. The judge studied the original note for what felt like an eternity. Then he looked up and said, "This clause is unusual, but it is binding. The language is clear. If either child is treated without dignity, the full inheritance reverts to them." The air cracked like thunder. My mother gasped softly, as though the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs. My father leaned toward their attorney, whispering furiously. My brother stared at me with eyes that could have burned through stone. Mr. Harlan placed the threatening text my brother had sent onto the table. "Your Honor, this is further evidence of the mistreatment Ms. Carter endured." Not only was she cast out of her home, but she was intimidated when she pursued her legal rights. The judge's brows furrowed. "Is this accurate, Mr. Carter?" My brother's lawyer fumbled for words, but my brother blurted out, "She's twisting everything." Emily never belonged in this family business. She was always the failure. Those words pierced me, but they also became my shield. The judge tapped his gavel. That outburst only confirms the attitude expressed in the clause. Disrespect is clear. In that moment, I felt the tide shift completely. Transitioning out of the courtroom later that afternoon, I walked through the marble hallway with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. I had gone into that room as the discarded daughter. I was leaving as the rightful heir. But the victory wasn't sweet, at least not yet. Because just outside, waiting near the steps, were my parents. Their faces were masks of pride cracked open by desperation. My mother was the first to speak. "Emily, listen. Mistakes were made, but we can fix this together. We're still family. That word tasted bitter. I looked at her, my voice calm but firm. "You told me I wasn't your daughter anymore. Do you remember that night? Because I do." Word for word. Her lips trembled, but before she could respond, my father stepped forward. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. Your brother was prepared. You weren't. We only wanted to protect the family's future." I shook my head slowly. "You weren't protecting the family's future. You were protecting your pride. And you forgot that I was part of this family too." For the first time in my life, I watched my father's eyes falter. He had no response. Then my brother stepped closer, his voice sharp, desperate. "If you think you've won, you're wrong. You don't have what it takes to run the company. You'll beg us for help." I looked him straight in the eye, the words coming before I could stop them. "Begging is what you did in there today. I don't beg anymore." That was the real turning point. Not the judge's ruling, not the legal papers, but that moment on the courthouse steps when I finally saw the truth. They needed me now more than I would ever need them. As I walked away, the fall wind whipped around me, scattering leaves across the pavement. Each step felt lighter than the last. My parents had thrown me out with nothing but a suitcase, convinced I was powerless. Now, the law had returned everything to me. Not just the inheritance, but the dignity they tried to strip away. And yet, even as triumph swelled inside me, a quiet thought lingered. This was only the beginning. Winning in court was one thing. Proving that I deserved to lead, to rise above their betrayal, was something else entirely. Taking back the inheritance didn't feel like the end of the story. It felt like stepping onto a battlefield I'd never trained for. A week after the court ruling, I moved into the Carter estate, my estate now. The house smelled the same cedar walls, the same polished floors, but it no longer echoed with belonging. It was a monument to everything I had endured. Boxes of my parents' belongings were still scattered around. I walked through the halls, each room whispering memories, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, arguments behind closed doors. I paused at the dining table where my father once raised a glass and announced, "To the future head of the Carter legacy." Only now, that head was me. Transition came quickly. Meetings with the board, endless stacks of documents, phone calls from employees who weren't sure if I was capable. I saw the doubt in their eyes, doubt carefully planted by my parents and my brother. They thought I was weak, just the cast-off daughter who had clawed her way back through luck. But then came the file. One late evening, while combing through company records in the study, I discovered hidden payments, millions routed to shell accounts. At first I thought it was sloppy bookkeeping, but the numbers told a darker story. My brother hadn't just wanted the company, he had been draining it. The realization slammed into me. They didn't just abandon me. They were destroying everything Dad built. I brought the findings to Mr. Harlan the next morning. He flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. "Emily, this is embezzlement. If these transactions come to light, your brother could face prison." For a moment, my stomach dropped. Prison. My brother wasn't just my rival, he was still my blood. But then I remembered his words on the courthouse steps. "You'll beg us for help." And suddenly, pity hardened into resolve. That night my phone rang. It was him. His voice was different, strained, nervous. "Emily, we need to talk. I know what you found. Please, don't take this further. We can work something out." It was the same man who had mocked me, cast me out, treated me like nothing. Now his tone carried something I'd never heard before. Fear. I took a deep breath and answered calmly. "You told me I'd regret fighting back. The only regret I have is believing you'd ever protect me as a sister." Silence stretched on the line, heavy and final. Transitioning into the next day, I stood before the boardroom table, presenting the evidence of his embezzlement. The directors shifted uncomfortably, but no one defended him. My brother had played himself out of the game. For the first time, I wasn't the girl left outside the door. I was the one holding the keys. And as I looked around that room filled with men and women who had doubted me, I spoke the words that changed everything. This company will no longer be built on favoritism or fear. It will be built on merit. Starting now. The room fell silent, but this time it wasn't dismissal. It was respect. Sitting in my father's old study, now my study, I finally felt the weight of everything that had happened. Months earlier, I was packing a single suitcase, thrown out like I was nothing. Now I was holding the reins of an empire my parents never believed I could carry. Sometimes at night, I still hear my mother's words echoing in my head. "You bring nothing but shame to this family." For a long time, I believed them. But standing here today, I realize the shame was never mine. It belonged to those who couldn't see my worth until it threatened their comfort. I didn't win because of revenge. I won because I refused to stay silent when the truth was in my hands. I won because I chose dignity over bitterness. The greatest lesson I've learned is this: being abandoned doesn't define you. What defines you is how you rise when you're pushed to the ground. Sometimes, rejection is the doorway to discovering your real strength. I don't know if I'll ever reconcile with my parents or my brother. Maybe forgiveness will come someday, maybe not. But what I do know is this: family isn't about blood. Family is about respect, loyalty, and love. And when those things are missing, you have every right to walk away and build something better. So, if you've ever been made to feel unwanted, remember my story. You are stronger than the voices that tell you you're not enough. You are worth more than the people who couldn't see your value. And if you've been listening this far, thank you for sharing this journey with me. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, and comment where you're watching from, because maybe your story deserves to be heard too. At the end of the day, the best revenge isn't taking back what was stolen. The best revenge is becoming everything they said you could never be.